Welcome to another lesson in the How to Cope series. Today, Dr. Lester Sumrall teaches from God's Word on how you can deal with the problems that confront all of us. Now, let's join Dr. Sumrall with today's topic.
Thank you. How does the world cope with tragedy? In Louisiana, I was asked to preach a funeral, and a child had been run over by an automobile and killed. And the parents were in deep sorrow. And after I had completed the funeral ceremony and had dismissed the people, I noticed that all of the neighbors, when they came by the parents of the child, didn't say a word, but they touched them. You know, they touched each one of them and released compassion, you know, because the tragedy was so great that words, you know, would have been idle words. But there was something about the human touch, and that's what we wish to do today. We want to bring the human touch to tragedy and let you know that we care. Tragedy is real. It's as old as the human race. But very few people have come to know how do you cope with tragedy when it strikes. Let us turn in our teaching syllabus to page 58, please. Our world bears a history of tragedy. You could really write the history of mankind in tragedy. The story of man can be written that way. Every human, sooner or later, experiences some kind of tragedy. There are no humans exempt from tragedy. And what do you do when tragedy strikes? Most people have not found out. They lose all the equilibrium. They're not the same person that they were before. Tragedy becomes a monster to them. We read in the book of Job about tragedy, and it covers a lot of territory. If you have a Bible, open it to Job chapter 1. Beginning in verse 13 says, there was a day. Yeah, you better believe it. There was a day when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabeans, that means war came, fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain your servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Now always remember, when there's tragedy, you've always got one left to tell the story. Always. Somebody's always glad to tell the bad news. They're bad news carriers. You'll always have one that can help you with the bad news. And verse 16, it says, and while this guy was yet talking, old tragedy number one, there came another one and said, the fire of God. Now, I don't really, accept that. But anyway, it says fire came from the heavens, fallen from heaven, and it burned up the sheep, and it burned up the servants, and it consumed them, and I only am escaped in order to tell you. Yeah, you always got one left to tell the story, and how they love to tell it. And what they're really glad of, that I'm the only one that can tell it. Nobody can tell it but me. Verse 17, and yet while he was speaking, sometimes tragedy comes boom, 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 you know. You say, hey, when is this going to stop? While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans, more war, came in 3 bands. They fell upon the camels and carried them away. They've slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. They wanted you to know it for sure. They says, I only, then they got alone down here. They give you kind of a double shot at to say, now listen, I just want you to know that I'm the only one that can tell this story. And while he was yet speaking, how many have seen tragedy like that? Yeah, while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their elder brother's house, and there came a great wind. Now, we've got from nature to war to fire from heaven, and so we got every kind of a possible problem that you can have coming at you. A great wind from the wilderness smote the 4 corners of the house and fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and I only am escaped to tell thee. Then Job arose, he rent his mantle, his coat. He shaved his head. He fell down upon the ground, and he worshiped Jehovah and said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, the Lord had taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And verse 22 is the text. In all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. The problem with sanity, you don't turn to the right source where the problem came from. He did not charge God foolishly. What do we mean by tragedy? A tragedy may be an unusual disappointment that you were hoping and hoping and hoping, and it fell through, and it was like a tragedy to you. It may come to you as a severe hurt, or it could come to you even as an accident. Tragedy could strike in that manner. The loss of treasure, or the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a friend is tragic. And that may be the way your tragedy comes, and your heart is hurt, your life is torn. When we look at the story of tragedy, point number 2 here begins with the first tragedy on record. It's in Genesis 3:14. It says, and Jehovah God said unto the serpent, because thou hast done this, thou art cursed with a curse above all cattle, and above all the beasts of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And I will put enmity, hatred, between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrows. Greatly multiply sorrow. And your conception in sorrow, that thou shalt bring forth the children. Thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. And unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In sorrow shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy brow thou shalt eat bread, till thou return to the ground. For out of the dust thou wast taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. What you want to see about tragedy, if you will study it very intimately, is this, that so very often tragedy is sin-related. And we oftentimes don't want to accept that. We just see the tragedy, but we don't want to see what caused that tragedy. There was no purpose in the world for this thing coming. It did not have to come. It was sheer rebellion against God, against Jehovah, against the Creator. Sheer rebellion in the heart, saying, hey, you did make me, but I will not obey you. It wasn't accidental. This thing came on purpose. It says, I want you to know that I'm not going to serve you. I'll not only rebel here, I'll rebel every time you open your mouth. I'll spit at you, you see. If you will study rebellion, if you will study tragedy, very often you're going to find it related to rebellion against God, or rebellion against the family, or rebellion against the church. You're going to find the seeds of rebellion related to tragedy. So study it. Don't just say, oh my, isn't that terrible? See what caused it. And then tragedy is sin-related, transgression-related. And if you get the thing in a proper perspective and say, well, what caused this thing? Now, I know there are instances when you can't tell what caused it. And those are the times, like Job, you're going to have to say, and I did not talk to God foolishly. You got to come to say, now, wait a minute. God is God, and I am a man, and God understands everything that I don't, and I'm going to believe, and I'm going to trust, and I'm going to discover that God is a good God. Praise his name. Now, the second tragedy came fast after the first one. In Genesis chapter 4, I'm just trying to show you that you don't have it all, and tragedy didn't begin with you. It began with man. In Genesis chapter 4, Cain talked with his brother Abel, and it came to pass when they were in the field, Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and he slew him. Now, can you imagine the first two ever born on the face of this earth? Adam and Eve were created. The first two that were ever born on the face of this earth, one killed the other. We hadn't gotten very far from that. We're still in that kind of world today. A man hasn't gone a lot deeper than he was in the beginning, you see. If you study my book on the book of Genesis, you'll find that every modern sin is in the book of Genesis. That's the first book of the Bible. So man hadn't just got bad, he's been bad ever since he rebelled against God. And he doesn't get good until he comes back to the God that he went away from. And God said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? And he said, I don't know. See, that was a lie. Every sin leads to another sin, you know. Every time. You do something wrong, and then it leads into something else wrong. He said, I don't know. After all, am I my brother's keeper? I have to walk around and take care of my brother? He said, what hast thou done? The voice of your brother's blood cries unto me from the ground. Well, if it did it then, it did it now. Oh, the cries that goes up to God for vengeance, for those that are killed in anger and in meanness on the face of this earth today. He says, and now thou art cursed with a curse. If God cursed him, you think he stopped? I think so. From the earth, which has opened up her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand, when thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. You know why a lot of people are sick today? The ground does not yield the strength that it used to. Are you here? You can go to primitive parts of the world, you can eat vegetables, and they take different from these vegetables that you put so much poison into in this country. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto you her strength. You can grow things, and it doesn't possess the strength that it had before. Then he says, and you shall be a vagabond, you shall be a fugitive, and upon the whole face of the earth. So we find here that their tragedy was, number one, related to jealousy. Cain got mad because one man was serving God a little better than he was, and God had blessed him a little bit, and he got angry about the blessing of God upon a brother. So it began first with jealousy, and then it moved into a relationship of anger, and into a relationship of hatred, and from there it moved into a relationship of murder. You have to watch out. Who you hate, you might kill one day. Don't be hating people. Be forgiving people. Be forgiving people. Oh, you said that's a sign of weakness. Well, ask God about that and see. He has all power and he forgives. You may be wrong on that score. All right. Now, there are tragedies. Let's get into some of those that we don't quite understand them. For example, Job had them. And now, in point 4 here, there are tragedies that come from storms. The last few days, they came from fires. Many people's houses were burned, and because of forest fires. They said that lightning started some of them, that the earth was just so dry until there was just a combustion that took place there. And those are some things that we can't grapple with, you know. It's a tragedy, but we don't have the power to grapple with it. And then there are floods. And you know, in the springtime, in the early summer, when there's floods all throughout the land, there are floods. And then other times there are earthquakes. And then there are volcanoes. There are what we call cosmic tragedies. We only know this. If man served God perfectly with all of his heart, he'd escape those things. Are you here or not? If man must serve the Lord with all of his heart, you'd escape those things. But there are some that we call tragedies in the cosmos. And then, number 5, there are tragedies caused by war. They're great. In your country, in our country, if you went back to my grandfather, you know, he could tell you what war tragedy is. Burned out cities, gutted buildings, and nationals killing nationals, civil war. But you have to go to places like Europe and Asia to see what modern war will do. I went through France right after the war, and over hundreds of acres you would see nothing left but a chimney, a brick chimney, and everything else was gone completely. And there were places where I'd lived before the war, and places where I'd preached before the war, and they were gone. And then you can see what tragedy is when it comes to war. When we first went to the Philippines, maybe 10 to 20% of the buildings were up and going. The rest of them had been blasted to pieces. The Supreme Court was in a meeting in a building that was 2/3 shot to pieces. And slowly, with the aid from other countries, they got the thing back together again and got the government back into buildings again. But they knew the devastation of war. that it is a terrible thing, and it can bring tragedy, and it can separate families, and it can destroy, parts of families, and war is a tragedy. And then we come to the thing that all of us know about, and that's called death. Death is a tragedy. Death comes because of man's sin. God did not create man to die, he created him to live, and through transgression man discovered death and has continued to know death. When we come perfectly into Christ and to live with him in our immortal bodies, we shall live forever. Time will be no more. We'll never be counting time anymore. It will never be any more time. And not knowing time, we shall not know death. And so we will be taken away from these type of tragedies. Death seems to strike many times just when the person is needed the most. Why could he be taken when he is needed more now than ever before? And for somebody that says that they understand all about death, they're just guessing. They do not understand all about death. There are things on the face of this earth that no human being does know. I don't care who he thinks he is. He does not know. If he doesn't look up to God, he does not have an understanding of the things that do exist. So there are tragedies that come in that way. And then there are personal tragedies. This is point number 6 in your teaching syllabus there. There are personal tragedies, and I've only listed 1 or 2 here. There are tragedies that come in the area of drowning. Almost all the days of the year. Just if it's not in the north, it's in the south. People die from drowning. Many times it's foolishness. Young people dive into an old pit of some kind, and their neck is broken and their back is broken, and if there's nobody there to help them, then they drown because they can't move their bodies around. Dive into swimming pools when they shouldn't do it. It's not shallow enough, or get out into water that's too deep for them and they can't swim properly. And so there are drownings, and it is a tragedy, but it's a human-related tragedy, that is. And then there are car accidents. In our country, how many have been involved in some kind of a car accident? Would you raise your hand? And that's something, at least half of us or more have been involved in some kind of a car accident. Sometimes it's a blown out tire, and sometimes it's the braking goes wrong. Sometimes it's the steering gear that goes wrong. Sometimes it's an alcoholic person that doesn't know where he's driving at and drives straight into you. But cars take off tens of thousands of humans every year off the face of this earth prematurely. Prematurely. It wasn't time for them to die. And then there are fires in homes and in hospitals and in nursing homes and in all kinds of places that are caused by all kinds of things. And these are personal tragedies. And then there's the basic one that we know so much about called sickness. And it comes and people die prematurely because of some illness that comes and it sweeps them away. And family is no tragedy. It's very remarkable that if the tragedy doesn't touch you personally, it don't hurt so bad. Yeah, if it's just in the newspaper, and if it's in some other country, well, you just pass it over and say, well, so what? But if it's in your own country, or in your own state, or in your own city, or in your own county, or in your own house, tragedy has another meaning. And it might be that you can read it in the papers and all, and yet not be affected by it. You want to know one of the saddest things in the world? I'll tell you what it is. Taking a doctor to the hospital, rolling him through the door, and let him look up and see those guys that got him in charge. It almost scares him to death. Are you here? Yeah, almost scares him to death. He's brave when he's in charge. When somebody else is in charge, it's another world down there. It's another world down there. Well, our problem and our lesson is this. How are we going to cope with the tragedies? This is just an introduction. You could go on for weeks, I suppose, talking about tragedy. Divorce is a tragedy, a terrible tragedy in the human experience here on the face of the earth. And there are accidents where you fall and you're crippled, and so there are just a million ways to have a tragedy. The lesson today is what you're going to do about it. Now, you know and I know that the same thing can happen to two people, and one goes up and one goes down. The same thing happens, but one goes up and one goes down. And so something inside of you has to teach you how do you deal with tragedy. Think in the life of Jesus there for a moment. How could he deal with Judas? who was a disciple, who was with him for over 3 years. How could he deal with a tragedy as Judas selling him the money on the block? He didn't hate Jesus that he would sell him for nothing. He had to have money for it. It wasn't a moral issue. It was a financial situation. You know, it wasn't a spiritual issue. He wanted money, and he sold him for money. For money. And sometimes you have a friend like that you go in business with them, the first thing you know, they're not a friend at all. They destroy you for money. How do you cope with such situations in life? I want to tell you something. As long as you've got breath and you're healthy, you're fortunate. You can take care of anything. You can handle anything. If you get the right attitude toward tragedy, you can conquer anything, and many times you can come out of it a stronger, better person because you have had experience with it. You can handle it, you know, you can handle life better by having gone through tragedy. You see, now I know. When I was dying of tuberculosis, I didn't know how to handle sickness. I was just hoping to get well every day. And when God healed me and brought me out of that thing, I've had an understanding of hurt. When you say I'm sick, well, I know what you're talking about. I've been there. You see, I've hurt until the doctor couldn't stop the hurt. The fever that wouldn't go away just kept on for weeks and months. You say, I know what you're talking about. If I never had any hurt, you say, you hurt. I say, what's that? So sometimes tragedy can be a blessing. Sometimes tragedy can wake you up to the realities of life. There's some people that live like a butterfly. They get in trouble, they come out of there and they say, hey, there's more to life than flitting. And then they take the issues of life and they start guiding life in a way that it should be. In your lesson, how do you cope with tragedy? Do not feel, this is number one, do not feel that you're the only one that has ever known tragedy. Now that's the way most people act. When they have a death in the family, they yell and they scream as if nobody else had ever died. And they want bushels and bushels of comfort as if nobody, and they've never given anybody else any. But they want bushels and bushels of comfort, saying, I need it worse than anybody else ever needed it. And if there's ever a human that needs help, come on, give it to me now. You say, but I did lose my husband. I did lose my wife. I know that. I'm only telling you that if you're going to, on the inside of you, feel like and act like and talk like that you are the only one that ever had tragedy, nobody's going to be able to help you. You've already fallen off the bottom rung of the ladder. There's nowhere to go. So don't feel that way. Number two, seek for strength other than human or natural strength. Now, normally when tragedy strikes, we lean toward people. People help me. People help me. But maybe they can't help you. Maybe they don't even have the words to help you. Maybe it's impossible for them to help you. Then you need to lean upon the supernatural. You need to lean upon Jesus Christ, who is the one who knows how to bear tragedy. When you do have tragedy, it's good to go to someone who's already had the same kind of tragedy, and they can tell you how to get out of the hole. What you going to say? All right. 1 Peter 5:7 says, cast all your cares upon Jesus, for he careth for you. You see? So when you're down, lay it upon Jesus. When you have a tragic experience, lay it upon Jesus. It says he cares for you. He's interested in you. He will lift you. He'll help you. And Isaiah 53:4 says, surely he hath borne our griefs. He has carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. He is the one that can help us. He is the one that can help you. When tragedy comes to your house, Jesus is there to bear it away, to comfort, and to heal, and to make life good for you. Can you say amen? All right. Number three, do not bear bitterness. Now bitterness has no healing qualities. Bitterness is just bitter. Say bitter. Many people get that way. When trouble comes, they get angry, they get mad, and they just stay that way the rest of their lives. They crawl into a corner and growl the rest of their lives. That's not the way to handle the problem. That is not the way to handle a problem. Do not become bitter. Bitterness will not heal. Set a positive course of action. Number one, to love others, to bless others, and to heal others. Now, that's the most healing thing I can tell you. If you're in the midst of tragedy, rather than looking on the inside of you, look out and see who you can love, who you can bless, who you can heal. And then the big one, number 5, says live for eternity. Not for here. If all of your living's here, hey, you've got a lot of briars along your path. But live for eternity, where tragedy never comes. In Revelation 21:4, God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, that is in heaven, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow, nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things, tragedy has all passed away. Thank God forever. I'm going to be glad to go to a place where there's no tragedy. Yeah, tragedy shall all be passed away. Then the Revelation, chapter 22 and 3, it says, and there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and the Lamb shall be in it, and his servants shall serve him. There will come the day when there will be no curse of any kind on the face of this earth. There'll be no heart hurts. There'll be no disappointments. So if you'll stand up strong right now and be what God wants you to be, you've got a future out there where you're going to rejoice and you're going to praise God. There's no sickness out there. There's no death out there. There are no accidents out there. It is absolute what God has in heaven, beauty and loveliness forever. And so I want us to live for him and serve him, and to take tragedy and put it under our feet and said, we are greater than tragedy. We're overcomers of tragedy, and we're going to love God and serve God and go to heaven.